The road was not so much a path as a scar upon the land, a wide, pale ribbon of hard-packed earth unraveling between endless shoulders of sun-bleached grass and gnarled, wind-twisted trees. It was a road that spoke of infrequent travel, of isolation so profound that the very air seemed to hold its breath. On such a road, a single figure stood out not as an interruption, but as a question mark. Lena felt the dust of that road deep in her bones. It coated the hem of her simple, dark dress, a fine powder on her worn leather shoes. Each mile from the distant port city had layered a new silence upon her, a quiet that was different from the bustling, familiar silences of home. This was a hollow, hungry quiet. The vast bowl of the sky, a relentless blue, pressed down, making her feel both exposed and insignificantly small. Her supplies, once carefully bundled, were now a light and worrying weight in her hand. Pine Ridge, they had said, was a place to start anew. But Pine Ridge was a ghost on the horizon, an idea that seemed to recede with every weary step she took. The sound, when it came, was a slow, grinding protest of wood and iron. It did not shatter the silence so much as it shouldered its way in. From the north, a wagon emerged, pulled by two sturdy, dusty brown horses. It was a ranch wagon, its flatbed empty save for a few stray strands of hay. On the high seat, a man sat with the loose, ingrained balance of someone who spent more time there than on solid ground. Thomas Bridger saw the woman from a distance. A dark spot against the gold of the grass. As the distance closed, the spot resolved into a shape, a posture, straight-backed yet weary. He took in the foreign cut of her clothes, the careful way she held herself, the aloneness of her. It was the aloneness that struck him. This was not a road for walking. The next homestead was 20 hard miles east, and Pine Ridge was a full day's drive south. A storm, the kind that built its fury in secret over the western peaks, was staining the edge of the sky a bruised purple. He drew the team to a halt a respectful few yards from her. The dust cloud they had kicked up drifted past, and for a moment she was framed in it, a figure in a fading dream. Her eyes, when they met his, were dark pools of quiet assessment. He saw no fear in them, only a profound fatigue and a stubborn core of dignity. He gave a slow, brief nod, the brim of his hat shadowing his own weathered face. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and precise, a melody unfamiliar to this rough land. "Can you take me to town?" She gestured slightly down the endless road. Tom's gaze lifted from her to the looming clouds in the west, then back to her thin shoes. He removed his hat, ran a hand through hair the color of old saddle leather. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low rumble, like distant thunder matching the sky. "Storm's coming. A mean one." He paused, considering his words with the same care he'd used to check a horse's hoof. "Pine Ridge is too far. Won't make it 'fore it breaks." He saw the slight stiffening of her shoulders, the flicker of dismay she quickly controlled. He gestured back the way he had come. "I have a ranch. The Circle B. It's on the way to nowhere, but it's closer. Got a guest cabin. Solid roof, a stove." He met her eyes squarely, offering not just shelter, but a choice. "You can stay there tonight. I'll take you to town in the morning, road permitting." The offer hung in the dusty air between them. Lena looked south, toward the unseen town and its promise of a difficult, lonely arrival after dark in a torrent. She looked north, toward the storm and the unknown ranch of this silent man. His eyes were the color of the river stone she'd seen earlier, gray, steady, holding no obvious threat, but no easy comfort either. It was the practicality in them that decided her. He had stated a problem and offered a solution, clean and simple as a ledger entry. She gave a single, graceful nod of acceptance. "Thank you. I will take your kindness." Without another word, he leaned down, extending a strong, calloused hand. She placed her much smaller one in it, and he lifted her onto the wagon seat beside him with an effortless strength that surprised her. He did not crowd her, there was a full foot of worn oak plank between them. He flicked the reins, and the wagon gave a lurch before settling into its slow, rolling rhythm. For a long time, the only sounds were the crunch of wheels, the creak of harness, and the sigh of the wind that was now picking up, carrying the damp, metallic scent of rain. They did not speak. He watched the land, the sky, the team. She watched the land unfold, seeing the rugged beauty of it, the hawks circling, the sudden flash of a creek through the trees. She also saw the bones of the land, the scattered, sun-bleached skull of a steer, a fence line clinging to a harsh slope, the sheer, back-breaking labor this place demanded. Once, when the wagon hit a deep rut, she was jostled against his arm. It was like leaning against a sun-warmed oak. He steadied her with a brief press of his elbow, then withdrew. "Road's rough," he muttered, the first words in miles. "It is a strong land," she replied softly, her gaze on a distant line of dark green pines. "It does not make itself easy." He glanced at her then, a longer look. A corner of his mouth, hidden by his beard, might have twitched. It might not have. "No," he agreed, his voice quieter. "It doesn't." The first fat, cold drop of rain struck the crown of his hat with a definitive tap. Then another. He urged the horses a little faster. As the rain began in earnest, a dark line advancing across the grassland toward them, he pointed with the whip toward a break in the trees ahead. "There," he said. And through the gathering gray veil of the downpour, Lena saw it, a cluster of low, solid buildings nestled in a protective curve of the hills. A ranch. A place out of the storm. A temporary haven offered by a man whose name she did not yet know, in a world so vast and empty that his simple nod now felt like the most significant anchor she had. The wagon turned off the main road, leaving the path to town behind, and carried them into the shelter of the unknown. The ranch yard, seen through the gray veil of the rain, was a testament to a solitary order. The main house was low and long, built of timber and river stone, with a porch that looked not toward the distant road, but inward toward the barns and corrals. The barn was a cathedral of weathered wood, vast and dark. And set apart, like a smaller satellite, was the guest cabin, a single room with a chimney of its own, nestled under the arms of a large, sheltering pine. Tom guided the wagon directly to its small porch, the horses blowing and stamping as the cold rain found its way down their necks. He did not help her down immediately. Instead, he leaped from the seat with a practiced motion, his boots splashing in the mud that was already beginning to form, and went to the cabin door. He produced a key, large and iron, and unlocked it, pushing it open to let the damp air inside first. He stood on the threshold for a long moment, as if checking the contents of a room he rarely visited, then nodded to himself and turned back. Only then did he offer his hand again. Lena took it, her fingers chilled, and stepped onto the solid planks of the porch, under its shallow roof which drummed with the sound of the downpour. "It's clean," he said, a simple statement of fact. "Woodbox is full behind the stove. Matches on the shelf." He stepped inside, and she followed. The room was spare, but far from barren. A narrow bed with a thick quilt stood against one wall. A small, black iron stove squatted on brick feet. A rough-hewn table and a single chair sat under a window that looked out toward the main house. A worn but clean rag rug covered part of the plank floor. It smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and the faint, dry sweetness of hay. It was, as he had promised, a solid roof. "I'll fetch your things," he said, and vanished back into the rain. She stood in the center of the room, absorbing its quiet. It was a space built for function, but it held no chill of neglect. It was ready. He returned with her small bag, placing it just inside the door. Water dripped from the brim of his hat onto the floor. "I'll be at the main house. Fire needs laying in the hearth there, too." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room once more, landing on her. "You'll be hungry. When the storm lets some come across. There's stew." He was gone again, a broad shape disappearing into the silver curtain of rain, leaving her alone with the sound of it on the roof. The isolation was immediate, but it was a different kind than the road. This was a contained isolation, a room of one's own in a wide, wild world. She set about making the space hers. She unfolded her few spare clothes, laid them on the chair. She found the matches and, with careful hands, built a small, bright fire in the stove, the kindling catching with a cheerful crackle that pushed back the damp. The heat began to radiate, a tangible comfort. She sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the storm's fury slowly temper into a steady, soaking rhythm. Perhaps an hour later, the rain softened to a drizzle. A muted twilight had fallen, turning the world outside her window to deep blues and grays. She saw a golden rectangle of light appear from the main house, and she knew it was an invitation. Wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, she made a dash across the yard, the wet ground yielding under her feet. The back door of the main house was unlocked. She stepped into a mudroom, then into the kitchen. The warmth here was profound, coming from a massive cast-iron range and a stone fireplace where logs now blazed. The room was dominated by the smell of the stew, rich, savory, with notes of herbs and meat. Tom stood at the stove, his back to her, stirring a large pot. He had shed his wet coat and hat. He wore a simple, faded shirt, the fabric stretched across the width of his shoulders. Without turning, he said, "Bowl on the table. Spoon beside it." She served herself, the steam warming her face. He filled his own bowl and sat at the far end of the long wooden table. They ate in a silence that was not empty, but filled with the sounds of the fire, the fading patter on the roof, the scrape of spoon on crockery. The stew was good, hearty, and simple. When she finished, she rose, took his empty bowl with hers, and carried them to a deep basin of water heating on the range. "I'll do that," he said, standing. "You provided the food and the fire," she replied, her voice quiet but firm in the firelit room. "The geometry is unbalanced. I will provide the labor of cleaning." She did not look at him, but began to wash, her movements efficient. He watched her for a moment, then leaned back against the edge of the table, arms crossed. He did not stop her. She washed, and he took a clean cloth to dry, placing the dishes on a shelf with a quiet clink. It was a small, domestic ballet performed in near total silence. When the last dish was put away, he moved to the large fireplace. "Night gets cold here, even with the rain," he said, kneeling. He began to build up the fire there, layering logs with a craftsman's care, ensuring it would burn long and slow. The new flames leapt, casting dancing light across the room, over the well-worn furniture, the shelves of books, the rifle above the mantel, and over the two of them. He rose, dusting his hands on his trousers. "That'll hold till morning." He looked at her, his face all planes and shadows in the flickering light. "You have everything you need?" She nodded. "Yes. Thank you." "Lock your door," he said, not as an order, but as a piece of advice about this place, like noting the location of the woodbox. "Good night." "Good night," she echoed. She crossed the damp yard again, the chill air sharp after the kitchen's warmth. Inside her cabin, her own smaller fire still glowed. She latched the door. The sound was final. In the main house, Tom banked the kitchen range and climbed the stairs to his own bedroom, a room as spare as the guest cabin. He lay in the dark, listening to the steady drip of water from the eaves. In her bed, Lena lay under the heavy quilt, her body weary but her mind awake. She traced the geometry he had mentioned without knowing it, the line of the road, the angle of his nod, the square of the cabin, the circle of lamplight on the table, the triangle formed by the two of them and the fire. It was a new shape, unfamiliar, its properties unknown. In the dark, she heard a soft, distant sound, the low, gentle nicker of a horse from the barn, a sound of creature comfort in the night. Somewhere across the black yard, in the house with the dying fire, the man who made that sound possible was also staring at a ceiling he knew by heart, seeing for the first time in a long time not just the familiar shadows, but the outline of a question, small and graceful and quiet, now sleeping under his roof. The space between their two beds felt vast, and yet, for the first time since she had arrived in this immense country, it did not feel empty. It felt alive with a silent, waiting potential, as tangible as the heat from the stove slowly filling the small, dark room. The dawn that followed the storm was a world reborn, washed in a pale, liquid gold and smelling of damp earth and released pine. From her window, Lena watched the ranch emerge from the gloom, steam rising from the sunstruck shingles of the barn. The road to town, she thought with a flutter of both hope and a new, unnameable reluctance, would be passable now. She dressed with care, smoothing her dress, and stepped out into the cool morning air. Tom was already in the yard, examining the left rear wheel of the wagon with a critical eye. He ran a hand along the iron rim, his expression grim. He looked up as she approached, his hat pushed back on his head. "Morning," he greeted, his voice a gravelly rumble in the fresh quiet. "Good morning," she replied. "The storm has passed." "It has," he agreed, straightening. He gestured to the wheel. "Storm didn't cause this. Dry rot in the spoke. Must have been working on it yesterday and finished it off." He kicked the offending wood lightly. "It'll hold for chores around here, but not for the weight of two on the road to Pine Ridge. Would shake apart on the first hard mile." The finality in his voice was not disappointment, but simple fact. The town, so symbolically close now with the clear sky, had just been pushed another day away by the stubborn reality of wood and wear. Lena absorbed this news. The flutter in her stomach settled into a different kind of anticipation. "What is needed?" she asked. New spoke. "I've got seasoned wood in the workshop. Needs carving, fitting. A day's work, if I start now." He looked at her, not with apology, but with a question of his own. "You're welcome to wait. Cabin's yours." She looked from the broken wheel to the vast, humming life of the ranch, the chickens scratching in the wet dirt, the horses watching with pricked ears from the corral, the smoke curling from the main house chimney. The geometry of her stay was shifting from a single night's line into a broader, more complex shape. "I do not wish to only wait," she said. "I can be useful. If you will show me." He considered her for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "Breakfast first." In the kitchen, he fried eggs and thick slices of ham. She made tea, finding the tin and the pot with an ease that surprised them both. They ate at the same long table, the sunlight now streaming across its scarred surface. This silence was easier, filled with the practical sounds of the morning. After eating, she saw the pile of his work clothes on a bench by the door, heavy denim trousers and a thick cotton shirt, both worn thin at the knees and elbows, bearing the stains of earth and sweat and grass. Without a word, she gathered them, along with a needle and strong thread she found in a kitchen drawer. He watched her but said nothing, a tacit understanding passing between them. He went to his workshop, a small, resin-scented building behind the barn, and she settled on the porch of the main house with his clothes and the bright sun for company. Her stitches were small, precise, and strong, a skill learned in a different world for different garments, but the principle was the same: to mend, to reinforce, to make whole. As she worked, her fingers moving with a rhythm older than the ranch itself, she listened to the steady, rasping sound of a drawknife shaving wood coming from the workshop. Two separate labors, two separate rhythms, harmonizing in the morning. It was later, as she turned the heavy trousers to darn a tear at the knee, that the needle, slick from her fingers, slipped. It plunged not into the fabric, but into the pad of her thumb, a sharp, sudden bite. She gasped, a small, sharp sound. A bead of vivid red welled up instantly. The rasping from the workshop stopped. Within moments, his boots were heavy on the porch steps. He stood before her, his gaze dropping to her hand. "Let me see." He did not wait for permission but took her wrist gently in his broad, calloused palm. His touch was cool and dry. He examined the small puncture, the blood welling. "Clean," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Needs binding." He led her not to the kitchen pump, but to a covered rain barrel at the corner of the porch. He scooped clear, cold water in a dipper and poured it over her thumb, the blood swirling away in pink tendrils. From his own pocket, he produced a clean, if frayed, handkerchief. Tearing a strip with a quick, strong motion, he wrapped the wound with a surprising delicacy, his thick fingers tying a secure, neat knot. He did not release her hand immediately. He held her smaller one in both of his, as if examining the repair on a precious tool. His thumbs brushed over her knuckles, over the delicate bones of her wrist where her pulse thrummed, a wild, frantic bird against his skin. The contrast was profound, his hands, mapped with scars and lines of hard labor, cradling hers, which bore the finer tracery of ink and needle. The contact sent a current through her, a jolt that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with the startling warmth of him, the absolute solidity of his presence so close. She saw his gaze fix on their joined hands, on the intimate paradox they made. His own breath seemed to slow, to deepen. He released her, the moment breaking like a dropped stitch. "Keep it clean," he said, his voice slightly thicker than before. He turned and went back to his workshop, the sound of the drawknife returning, its rhythm now slightly altered, less steady. The afternoon sun climbed high. When she brought him a cup of water later, she found him in the dim workshop, shirtless in the heat, bent over the vise that held the new spoke. The muscles of his back and shoulders moved in a complex, powerful landscape of ridges and hollows, gleaming with a fine sheen of sweat. The drawknife moved in his hands with a fierce, focused grace. She stood in the doorway, the cup forgotten in her good hand, watching the play of light on his skin, the dedication of his body to the task. He sensed her presence and turned, his chest rising and falling with the effort. Their eyes met across the dusty space. In his gaze, she saw not just the acknowledgement of her watching, but a heat that mirrored the sun outside, a raw and unguarded flash that spoke of a different kind of labor, a different kind of hunger. He did not look away, and neither did she. The air in the workshop, thick with the scent of cut wood and male sweat, became charged, almost difficult to breathe. He straightened, taking the cup from her silently, his fingers brushing hers. He drank deeply, his eyes holding hers over the rim. When he handed it back, he said, "Horses need their evening feed. Could use a hand, if yours is up to it." Her thumb throbbed beneath its bandage, a persistent, sweet ache. "It is," she said. In the barn, the world was golden with motes of hay dust floating in slanting sunbeams. He showed her the bins of oats, the sweet-smelling hay. He handed her a brush. "For the bay mare. Long, smooth strokes. Follow the lay of the coat." He worked on the other side of the stall, his own brush moving in firm, rhythmic circles. Lena began, her strokes tentative at first, then gaining confidence. The mare sighed, her lower lip drooping in pleasure. The simple, physical act of caring for another creature was a silent, profound language. Then, his hand was over hers on the brush, not to guide, but to share the sensation, to feel the vibration of the bristles through her skin. His chest was close to her back, his heat radiating against her. He did not speak. His breath stirred the hair at her temple. Her own breath caught. His hand tightened over hers for a moment, a pulse of pressure that spoke of a contained strength, of a desire held in careful check, before he slowly released her and moved away. That evening, they ate the leftover stew. The silence between them was a living thing, woven with the unspoken threads of the day, the shared shock of blood and bandage, the sight of his toiling body, the press of his hand in the hushed barn. It was a silence filled with a new and potent vocabulary, one written in glances that lingered, in the careful space between their bodies that now seemed to hum with proximity. When he rose to bank the fire, his movement seemed to stretch the very air between them. "Will should be set by noon tomorrow," he said, not looking at her, staring into the red embers. "Road will be dry." She understood. The obstacle was nearly removed. The path was clearing. The geometry was shifting once more, threatening to become a simple, straight line pointing away from this place. The knowledge sat between them, heavy and resonant. The guest cabin, when she returned to it, felt less like a shelter and more like a threshold. As she lay in the dark, the memory of his hands, rough, skilled, gentle, played across her skin like a physical touch. Across the yard, in the quiet house, Tom stood at his own window, looking at the light in her cabin until it went out. He flexed the hand that had held hers, feeling the ghost of her pulse, the delicate weight of her bones. The broken spoke had been an accident of decay, but the repair it had initiated felt like the beginning of something else entirely, something being carved not from seasoned wood, but from the raw, unexpected grain of two solitary lives brought into sudden, undeniable alignment. The language of the day had been one of actions, not words, and its grammar was one of touch, a sentence left powerfully, perilously unfinished. The morning dawned with a deceptive normalcy, clear and bright. Tom was at the wagon by first light, fitting the new, pale spoke into the wheel assembly with methodical focus. The repair was a clean, solid piece of work, the fresh wood a stark, honest scar against the old. By mid-morning, the wheel was whole, the wagon once again a vessel for departure. He announced its readiness with the same plain factuality he used for the weather. "She's sound. We can leave after the noon meal." Lena received this news with a quiet nod. The inevitable had arrived, sharp and defined as the edge of his chisel. She moved through the morning in a state of heightened awareness, feeling the texture of every moment like cloth held to the light. She swept the cabin floor, erasing the faint traces of her occupation. She folded the quilt with care, restoring the room to its prior state of waiting emptiness. Each action was a silent farewell to a possibility that had never truly been spoken. The noon meal was a quiet affair. The stew was gone, replaced by cold meat, bread, and cheese. They ate at the long table, the distance between them feeling like a canyon carved by the impending journey. The easy, charged silence of the previous day had hardened into something brittle. Words seemed dangerous, capable of shattering the careful, unspoken truce that had held them. When the last crumb was cleared, Tom rose. "I'll hitch the team," he said, his voice low. "Meet you at the wagon." He walked out, his shoulders set. Lena remained at the table, her hands flat on the worn wood. She looked around the kitchen, at the fireplace where he had built the fire that first night, at the basin where she had washed the bowls, at the doorway where he had stood watching her mend his clothes. This was not her home. It was his. A place of solitary order, of routines undisturbed. Her presence had been a temporary asymmetry, now to be corrected. She went to the guest cabin for the final time, to collect her bag. As she lifted it, the sky through the west window caught her eye. While the east was still a serene blue, in the west, over the highest peaks, a towering wall of cloud was assembling itself, not the gray of rain, but a deep, bruised purple-black, shot through with ominous threads of greenish light. It was a second storm, but of a different, more violent character, a behemoth moving with a silent, predatory grace. Even as she watched, the first gust of wind hit, a hot, frantic breath that rattled the windowpane and sent dust devils spinning in the yard. She hurried out, bag in hand, as Tom was leading the harnessed team from the barn. The wind snatched at her dress and his shirt. He followed her gaze to the western horizon, and his face tightened. He knew these skies, their language of fury. "That's no rainstorm," he said, his voice raised against the rising gale. "That's a mountain breaker. Hail, maybe a twister. We're not going anywhere." The decision was made not by man, but by the ancient, indifferent power of the weather. There was no debate, no consideration. Survival instinct took over. "Get to the main house," he barked, not in anger but in urgent command. "Cellars under the kitchen. Go." He turned to unhitch the team, needing to secure the panicking horses in the sturdy barn. Lena ran, the wind pushing at her back as if hurrying her along. She flung open the kitchen door just as the first hailstone struck, a deafening cannonade on the shingled roof, some as large as robins' eggs, pounding the earth into a furious, white spray. The world outside dissolved into a roaring, chaotic gray. He burst in moments later, soaked from the brief dash, bolting the door behind him. The noise was apocalyptic, the hail's relentless drumming, the shriek of the wind trying to pry its way under the eaves. The house creaked and groaned like a living thing in pain. "Cellar," he shouted again, pointing to a door in the kitchen floor she hadn't noticed. He yanked it open, revealing a dark maw. "Down. Now." She descended the rough wooden steps into the cool, damp darkness. He followed, pulling the door shut above them, plunging them into a blackness absolute but for a thin sliver of light from a small, high window well. The roar of the storm became muffled, a distant, monstrous rage. Here, in the earth, was a profound, vibrating silence. They stood in the dark, listening to their own breath, to the distant fury. The cellar smelled of potatoes, cured meat, damp stone, and time. As her eyes adjusted, she could make out the shadowy forms of storage shelves, barrels, his shape a denser black against the gloom. Time lost its meaning. It could have been minutes or an hour. The hail's fury eventually lessened, replaced by the solid, drowning rush of torrential rain. The tension of immediate danger slowly ebbed, leaving in its wake a different, more intimate kind of tension. They were trapped together in a pocket of the earth, in a silent, dark intimacy more complete than any the sunlit world could offer. Perhaps it was the shared vulnerability, the stripping away of all pretense and future plans by the storm's brute force. Perhaps it was the accumulated weight of every glance, every accidental touch, every silent meal across the long table. In the dark, words finally became not dangerous, but necessary. "Are you hurt?" His voice was close, a rumble in the dark. "No." "You?" "Fine." A long pause, filled only by the drumming rain above. "This country," she said softly, her voice seeming to belong to the darkness itself. "It does not give its peace easily." "It doesn't give anything easily," he replied. "You have to take it. Or build it yourself. Alone." The last word hung there, heavy with the truth of his life. "And if you are tired of being alone?" The question was out before she could think to stop it, born of the dark and the shared, pounding heartbeat of the storm. He did not answer with words. She heard him move. A match scraped, flared, its tiny light blinding. He lit a lantern she hadn't seen, hanging from a beam. A soft, golden glow pushed back the dark, illuminating his face, grave and starkly handsome, and hers, pale and openly waiting. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, or as if seeing the answer to a question he had long stopped asking. "Then you stop," he said, the words simple and final. He closed the distance between them. There was no hesitation, no gentle preamble. His hands came up to cradle her face, his touch at once possessive and reverent. He searched her eyes, finding no refusal, only a mirror of the same desperate, held-breath longing. He kissed her. It was not a question. It was a claiming and an offering all in one, a release of a dammed-up river of solitude. His mouth was hard and hungry on hers, and she answered with a hunger of her own, her hands coming up to clutch at the hard muscles of his arms, anchoring herself against the tide of sensation. The lantern light flickered, casting their merging shadows against the stone wall. What followed was a slow, deliberate unbinding. In the hushed, subterranean air, punctuated only by the rain's ceaseless rhythm, garments became obstacles to be patiently overcome. His rough fingers, so skilled with tools and horseflesh, fumbled only once with the intricate fastenings of her dress, his patience a form of worship. The fabric, once loosened, fell away with a sigh. Her own hands were no less diligent, mapping the terrain of him, unbuttoning the damp, clinging shirt, pushing it over the formidable breadth of his shoulders, her palms learning the fierce heat of his skin, the crisp texture of hair on his chest. He lifted her onto a stack of sturdy grain sacks, their coarse fabric a thrilling contrast to the sudden vulnerability of her bare skin. The lantern light gilded the curves of her body, and he looked his fill, his gaze a physical caress that made her shiver. There was no shyness, only a profound, aching necessity. He shed the rest of his clothes, and she saw the full, powerful truth of him, a body forged by labor, scarred and beautiful in its strength. Their coming together was not a gentle merging, but a confluence of two desperate currents. There was a moment of acute, burning fullness as he entered her, a joining that felt less like a new beginning and more like a homecoming to a place neither had known they belonged. The rhythm they found was ancient, dictated by the pounding of their hearts and the fading echo of the storm above. It was a dialogue of gasps and murmured, wordless assurances, of hands grasping, seeking, holding. He moved within her with a powerful, restrained urgency, each stroke a silent vow, each sigh from her lips a benediction. She arched against him, her world narrowing to the points of contact, his mouth on her throat, his hands gripping her hips, the deep, relentless friction building a coil of pure, blinding sensation in her core. When release tore through her, it was a silent, shattering wave that pulled him with her into the abyss. He buried his face in the curve of her neck, a low, broken groan escaping him as he spent himself inside her, the final, profound surrender. For a long time afterward, they remained entwined on the rough-hewn bed of sacks, their breathing slowly calming, skin slick and cooling in the damp air. The storm above had softened to a steady rain. He shifted them, pulling a spare horse blanket from a shelf to cover them, wrapping her against him. No words were needed. The act had been a language more complete than any they had yet shared. In the quiet aftermath, listening to the rain, they both knew the wagon outside, now pelted and clean, was no longer a vessel to take her away. It was an artifact of a life that had ended the moment the cellar door had closed behind them. A new life, raw and real and still unnamed, had begun in its dark, fertile hold. The rain did not cease so much as it exhausted itself, fading by imperceptible degrees from a roar to a whisper to a mere dripping melody from the eaves. In the cellar, time had been rewritten, measured not in minutes but in heartbeats and shared breaths. They dressed slowly, in the guttering lantern light, their movements now speaking a fluent, silent language. A button fastened by her fingers received a brush of his knuckle in thanks. The settling of his shirt over his shoulders was watched by her eyes with a new, profound familiarity. When they ascended the rough steps and pushed open the cellar door, they emerged not as rescuer and rescued, not as host and guest, but as two people who had been unmade and remade together in the dark. The kitchen air was cool and clean, washed by the storm. The world outside the windows was a dazzle of wet emerald and dripping gold, every leaf and blade of grass holding a jewel of rainwater. The hail had littered the ground with a scattering of icy marbles, already melting into the grateful earth. The wagon stood where it had been abandoned, glistening and unharmed. It was a sight that once would have symbolized departure. Now, it was merely a thing, an object of wood and iron holding no more sway over their fate. He did not speak of the road to town. He simply walked to the back door, opened it, and stood looking out at his land, steaming and vibrant in the post-storm sun. She came to stand beside him, not touching, but their shoulders almost brushing. The silence between them was full, pregnant with a decision that had already been made in the blood and bones, but awaited its voice. "The road will be muddy," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. "A day for the sun to bake it firm." She looked not at the road, but at the ranch yard, at the chickens venturing out from their shelter, at the guest cabin with its door still ajar. "I mended your clothes," she said, her voice clear. "I learned the brush strokes for the bay mare. I know where the woodbox is kept behind the stove." She paused, gathering the words that would change the geography of her world. "It seems a poor trade. A few chores for a roof, for food, for shelter from the storm." She turned to face him fully then, her dark eyes meeting his river-stone gaze. "A life cannot be balanced on such a thin ledger." He turned toward her, his whole body attentive, the morning light catching the lines of his face, lines she now knew the feel of under her lips. "What are you saying?" "I am saying the wheel is fixed," she said, gesturing to the wagon. "The path is clear. But I find I do not wish to get in." She took a breath, the most important of her life. "I think my fresh start is not in Pine Ridge. I think it is here. If the offer of the cabin still stands. Not as a guest, but as a resident." The words hung in the damp, sweet air. For a moment, he was utterly still. Then, something monumental crumbled behind his eyes, a fortress of solitude he had built stone by stone over years falling not with a crash, but with a sigh of release. He closed the small distance between them, his hands rising to cup her face with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "The cabin is yours," he whispered, his thumb stroking her cheek. "But this house has been empty for too long. It needs a resident, too." He kissed her then, softly, a seal upon a new covenant. "Stay with me." And so, she stayed. That night, she did not cross the yard to the guest cabin. She ascended the stairs to his room, a space as functional as the rest, dominated by a wide bed of hand-hewn timber. Here, in the soft dark of a known space, their joining was different. It was not the frantic confluence of the cellar, but a deep, exploratory conversation. There was time, now. Time for him to trace with his mouth every dip and curve of her body, learning the taste of her skin at the inside of her elbow, the sensitive hollow behind her knee. Time for her to learn the power and patience of his body, to guide him with her hands, to rise above him and take him inside her with a slow, deliberate certainty that made him shudder with a pleasure deeper than any he had known. They made love with the windows open to the sound of the creek, swollen with rain, a constant, joyful murmur to their own sighs and whispered discoveries. They slept tangled, her head on his chest, his arm a possessive weight across her waist, as if to guard against any possibility of her being a dream. The days that followed were not a courtship, but a consolidation. Lena's presence began to alter the very texture of the circle bee. It was in small things: a pot of early wildflowers on the kitchen table, a different, aromatic steam rising from the stew pot with herbs she gathered from the hillside. She claimed a patch of earth near the kitchen door for a garden, turning the soil with a fierce, hopeful determination. He watched her, often from a distance, the sight of her bending to her work, a wide-brimmed hat of his shading her face, sending a wave of pure, possessive warmth through him. He began to speak more, pointing out the names of birds, explaining the temperament of each horse, sharing the quiet history written in the scars of the land. He took her riding, teaching her, her body pressed against his back on the horse, her arms around his waist as they climbed to the high meadows where the view stretched for eternity. They made love in the high grass under the endless sky, a joining that felt as natural and as sacred as the land itself. The ranch hands, a pair of grizzled, taciturn brothers, observed this change with initial, wary curiosity. They saw the way the boss looked at her, the way her word on a matter of the kitchen or garden was now law. They saw the new, unspoken light in his eyes. One evening, she brought a basket of fresh biscuits out to them as they finished mending a fence. They ate in surprised silence, then the older one tipped his hat. "Much obliged, ma'am." It was a small thing, a title of respect, but it was her official welcome into the fabric of the place. A week after the storm, Tom hitched the team to the wagon once more. He loaded a sack of grain to sell, a few hides to trade. Lena, wearing a simple dress of practical blue, her hair in a long, neat braid, came out of the house. He helped her up to the seat, not as a passenger, but as a partner. "Where are we going?" she asked, though she knew. "To town," he said, taking the reins. "Got some business. And I aim to introduce my wife." The word, the first time he had spoken it aloud, settled between them with a profound rightness. She did not correct him, for it was the truth in every way that mattered. They rode down the road that had once been her escape route, now simply a connector to the wider world. He held her hand on the seat between them, his thumb rubbing circles on her palm. Pine Ridge was a cluster of wooden buildings, dusty again after the storm's washing. Eyes followed them as they walked the main street, his hand at the small of her back. He did not flinch from the stairs, his posture one of quiet, unassailable pride. At the general store, he introduced her, his voice firm. "This is Lena Bridger." The storekeeper, a man of shrewd eyes, saw the way the rancher stood close to her, the way her hand rested lightly on his arm, and he simply nodded and extended his hand in welcome. They bought coffee, nails, a bolt of soft cloth the color of sage. They were not a spectacle, but a fact. A new fact in an old land. That evening, back on their own land, they sat on the porch of the main house as the sun bled orange and purple behind the western peaks. She sat on the steps, leaning back against his legs where he sat in a chair. His hand rested on her shoulder, his fingers toying with the end of her braid. The silence was their richest dialect. "The garden will need a fence," she said, watching the first fireflies wink over the meadow. "To keep the rabbits out." "I'll start on it tomorrow," he replied. "I saw wild roses by the creek. I could make a syrup." "I'd like that." Below them, the ranch lay peaceful in the twilight, every building, every fence line, every animal now part of her inner map. The guest cabin was a tool shed now. Her things were in his room, their room. Her future was in the strength of the hand on her shoulder, in the land that stretched before them, in the new life quietly growing in the secret warmth of her belly, a truth she would share with him soon, under the next full moon. Their story was not one of a dramatic rescue, but of a mutual finding. It was a story written not in grand declarations, but in mended cloth, in repaired wheels, in the shared heat of a storm-dark cellar, and in the quiet, daily choice to build something together from the raw materials of solitude and hope. It was the story of an unexpected love that became, simply, love. A love as deep-rooted and enduring as the hills themselves. If you were moved by the journey of Lena and Tom, if you felt the crackle of their first touch or the peace of their final sunset, then a world of similar stories awaits. Subscribe to our newsletter to have tales of rugged hearts, unexpected romance, and deeply earned passion delivered directly to your inbox. Become a part of our community of readers who believe that love, in all its forms, is the most compelling frontier of all. Your next adventure in emotion is just one subscription away.